very warm welcome to you all, and especially to our guest presenter today, and Pasley, who has come from the other side of the globe. And I have had the pleasure, I am Jane Osgood, Professor Jane Osgood here at Middlesex University, and I've had the pleasure of knowing Anne for several years now. We met in person in 2022 before the world went into lockdown, literally just before. And since that time, we've maintained our contact virtually, and I've been following with interest your career and your work and your publications as they have come into the world. So it's an absolute joy and pleasure to have you here with us, sharing your work. I'm not going to say too much about who you are and what you do, because I imagine that will become very clear as you present this afternoon. But just to say a very, very warm welcome. And the structure of the afternoon is that you will present your work for as long as you need, but for around about an hour. And then we'll have time for question, answers, comments, and so on. And a very open, convivial space in which we can grapple with some of the ideas that you have shared with us. So welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Cheers. Thank you all for coming. And, some of you I've known for a while and others we've just met today. And I'm very happy that everyone else is joining online. And for those of you who watch it later, I hope you enjoy this as well. Right, so the work that I'm going to talk to you about today is sort of, it emerged from my doctoral research where I was engaging with trans experiences of education in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And yeah, that just sort of, when you get out of the doctorate, there's this wonderful thing where you can go and pursue all of the questions that you wanted to ask and investigate, but you're not allowed because you're supposed to focus and finish the PhD. But yes, so a little bit about me. I did my PhD at the University of Auckland, and I was supervised by Professors Louisa Allen and Marek Teza. And so their work has very much sort of influenced me in this regard as well. And this presentation is based on a chapter I've been writing for a book on, broadly speaking, critical posthumanisms, with my colleagues Alejandra Jaramillo Aristizabal and Noah Romero. So this presentation is basically based on my third of the chapter. To begin with, we start looking at modern colonial humanism as sort of the starting point of this mess that we're in. To sort of give a brief overview, we're looking at sort of Enlightenment thinking, things like positivism, dualism, anthropocentrism, temporal linearity, and so on and so forth, that sort of build up this notion of how the Western world sort of construes the places that they exist in. And sort of out of this world building and this epistemological knowledge building is the sense that this isn't just our world, it's everybody's world, whether you like it or not. And so De La Cadena talks about one world ontologies and the way in which the Western world is sort of imposed on the rest of humanity. And they sort of have, basically said, well, it's our way or the highway. And her work sort of unpacks the way in which, in order to be, considered part of the political sphere, you have to reject non-Western views in order to engage in political discourse. And so basically there's this devaluation of people who don't sort of live in this sphere. And so we take up this notion of the coloniality of power that comes out of Annabel Chiano's work, and this basic generation of hegemony among the world, this Eurocentrism, this notion of European supremacy, and the sorts of structures that justify it. And in the process of doing this, we see the creation of what Sylvia Wynter calls the genres of man. So how we classify humans and how people qualify as human, whether it is labeling people as men and women, or as queer, or as sort of existing in all of these supposed human categories. And basically, the rest is history. We have to deal with it. And these things that we deal with, we call colonialities, or the ongoing inheritance of colonization. Now, before I continue, I just like to point out this guy in the slide. I think he's incredibly interesting. He's just like, ugh, look at you with your flag. But I just think that that there's so much room for humor in looking at the way in which these people sort of just like pranced onto these lands. We're like, we're so unequipped, but we will conquer you. This is the creation of humanism, and humanism is by no means a blank slate. But I suppose what we're concerned with in our field is this idea of post-humanism. Now, I'm in the UK, and so this next one I can really only do here, so I have to take advantage of it. Post-humanism. But there is a lot of misconception around what post-humanism sort of entails. So we see not just post-manism, but confusions around the ways in which people engage with post-humanism. And just before I came over to this side of the world, I was at a talk by Rosie Braidotti, who talks about how so much of what we think of as part of the post-human conversation is really transhumanism, and this idea that we're obsessed with finding more than human ways of enhancing ourselves. We're more interested in notions of entanglement and thinking about relational ontologies, the ways in which post-humanism opens up ways of thinking about how everything is connected and co-constituted. And we're more concerned with thinking about the more than human and how we're entangled with the more than human in ways that decenters us, that it's no longer an anthropocentric perception. And so post-humanism replaces positivism with immanence, and dualism with multiplicity, and anthropocentrism with the more than human, individualism with entanglement, temporal lineality with hauntology or hauntological notions of time, realism, discursivism sort of dualities with material discursivity, recognizing that these things co-constitute one another, and epistemology, or the idea that we just we learn about this world that exists out there and we can't change it, as onto-epistemology, that the way in which things are known and how they exist are inextricable from each other, and so on and so forth. And so there's this sort of perception that post-humanism is this new opportunity for a utopia, a new opportunity to right the wrongs of humanism. But I suppose that these sorts of things are really called into question when we start considering the sorts of ideas that sort of underpin it, or that don't underpin it. I'm really interested in Indigenous and Black or blackened critiques and wariness around post-humanism. The way in which people like Brendan Hokowhitu, who wrote a brilliant chapter called The Emperor's New Materialism, questions, well, really, what's new about new materialism? Like, what is this claim to newness and nuance? And he talks about the way in which so much of what is often postured as this new thinking is often Indigenous 101, these really basic ideas. Vanessa Watts talks about the cautiousness around the appropriation of Indigenous ideas, and that Western academia has this sort of extractivist relationship, which looks a lot like the relationship that they had with the lands that they colonized. And so there's this really problematic relationship there. Zoe Todd talks about the citational politics within academic spaces and the way in which she turned up to a lecture about climate change and environmental catastrophes led by Latour, and he didn't once cite the many Indigenous academics who are working in these spaces and have been working in these spaces for much longer than many Western scholars have been working in. Sundberg sort of has this critique of the way in which posthumanism is often framed in a sort of developmentalist way, where humanism is assumed to be a passage through which societies have to travel through in order to get to posthumanism, which sort of ignores the fact that many societies have resisted humanism for as long as it's been around, and many of them have done so successfully. Zakiya Iman Jackson talks about how posthumanism is often haunted by humanism in ways that we sort of refuse to recognize. The fact that we share imperialist origins and imperialist sort of logics with humanism in posthuman spaces, and yet we sort of disavow the origin of these sorts of logics. And so this sort of sanctioned ignorance in posthuman spaces sort of creates this danger of reproducing colonization or recolonizing academic spaces. And I should say, as a disclaimer, that there are plenty of really good examples of posthuman practices. But I do think that there is this hangover from humanism, and particularly that is maintained by the power dynamics within academia and within Western-centric spaces, that tends to sort of reinforce these sorts of power dynamics between, Western ideology and Indigenous ideas or black ideas. I should also note that blackened is a term that Jackson uses to talk about how black is a verb. Blackening is a verb that is done for people rather than an inherent characteristic, and that this sort of this production of blackening is an ongoing sort of process that posthumanism sort of partakes in by sort of othering these sorts of positions and perspectives or extracting knowledge from. That sort of leads me to the spaces that I work in. And so for me, thinking about the ethics of gender, it was integral for me to trace back the origins of how we start thinking about gender in the first place, and what Lugones calls the coloniality of gender, or the invention of gender through the modern colonial project. And so Lugones really sort of drawing on Keanu's colonialities of power and Crenshaw's intersectionality creates this concept that recognizes that race and gender were entangled and were key tools in the production of the modern colonial project, and that gender was used as a mark of civilization, a way of saying, well, this is how humans behave. It just so happens that this behavior and these gender roles are Western gender roles. And so this sort of framing of this very narrow idea of what a human is, not only engaged in the production of, or the reproduction of, sort of patriarchal hegemony in other places, but it basically allowed colonizers to say that, well, all of you colonized people, you don't behave like us, and therefore you're not human enough. And that was used to justify the enslavement or occupation of Indigenous lands. Projects like Terra Nullius, where the First Nations people of Australia were essentially classified as flora and fauna for a long period of time. And in this whole process, there's this justification of sexism, this dualism of gender roles, where white men in particular are positioned as powerful and white women are positioned as submissive. And this was sort of justified within even from women who were subject to this sexism, because it was basically a case of saying, well, at least I'm not at the bottom of the pile. And this whole process destabilized Indigenous societies by essentially having enough people sort of buy into these new paradigms, or being forced into these new paradigms by colonizers refusing to engage with women, or people who were perceived as women, which basically led to the induction of cis heterosexism in colonized societies. And so it's really important to sort of understand that cis normativities or compulsory gender roles are a colonial inheritance, that we have to wrestle with the consequences of colonization day to day. And that comes in sexism, homophobia, transphobia, the binarization of gender, and so on and so forth. And so for me, in the sort of spaces that I'm working in, I'm particularly concerned with transnormativities and the way in which these cis normativities have sort of been passed on and rendered compulsory for other people. We often think that trans people may have a way out of the sort of rigid gender roles that cis normativities enforce in our society, and yet in many cases trans people are actually subject to much higher stakes of trying to impersonate these gender roles and creating these normative expectations around what it means to be trans. So if you're not a hypermasculine trans man, you're not trans enough. If you're not a hyperfeminine trans woman, you're not trans enough. And there's an amazing paper by McIntyre that asks, why are they so normal? How do we operate in these ways? And there's a whole history around the sort of creation of these normativities, which I don't really have time to go into, but this looking at how we sort of justify this this narrow way of being in the world. And so trans normativities mirror cis normativities in the way that they reflect this binary, and they're very trans-medicalized in the way in which there are, the medical system gatekeeps who is able to be trans enough is essentially what has been going on. And there have been various forms of resistance over the years, but at the end of the day, these are the sorts of barriers that people continue to face. And we see these things replicated within our education systems and sexuality education in general. And Kathleen Quinlivan talks about how progressive sexuality education engages in the production of these sorts of normativities and trans normativities in particular, through this politics of liberal recognition, of only recognizing those who actually fit this normative version of transness or queerness. And she sort of sees so much of progressive sexuality education as a way of recuperating queerness into these normative models, so that we don't upset the sort of normative system and we're not unpalatable for dominant notions of gender. And I suppose a really key thing about this is that we talk about these trans normativities, but we need to appreciate that all of these norms are entangled. And so back in 1994, Susan Stryker talked about the whiteness of transsexuality and the way in which medical systems really reproduce these colonial notions of gender, that really gender is a mark of whiteness. It's a performance of whiteness, regardless of the color of your skin. And that and that like blackened bodies are sort of performed rather than simply being, so are white bodies, and whiteness becomes this performance through gender. And so we sort of look to posthumanism and sort of go, well, like, what could posthumanism do for us here? Like, could posthumanism help us undermine the sorts of humanist ideas of the genres of man that these Enlightenment epistemologies have sort of created? Posthumanism, can we undo the sex, gender, sexuality matrix? The Judith Butler's heterosexual matrix. Can we undo binaries? Can we embrace non-binaries? Can we undo the positivism of gender, suggesting that gender is something out there that we go and achieve, that it exists before we perform it? We can undo dualistic notions of cis and trans. We can recognize that the very production of transness is part of the reproduction of colonial categories of those who qualify as gendered subjects. Can we undo linear transition so that we don't see it as going from male to female in this linear way, that we don't see it as, you go social transition and then you have hormones, and then you have surgeries, and then you become fully trans, as if this is ever something really possible. Instead, trans becomes this ongoing transition that's never really finished and doesn't have a beginning and an end, or it's constantly middling, which means something different in England, but fear to middling. And it enables us to recognize the more than human agency. There's a really great paper by Ernie that looks at the agency of hormones and the way in which they compel us in different directions, and that there is all of this agency that exists outside of our sort of conservative notions of who's performing gender. And it enables us to sort of dismantle this transcendental policy. This idea that policy is from up here and imposed on people, and instead it affords this opportunity to co-produce policy in ways that benefits communities. I mean, all of these things are fantastic, but they are still sort of framed in relation to this notion of trans rights as human rights. And you start to notice these notions sort of creeping back in, because for so long we weren't human enough. And there's this sort of creeping fear that, well, what happens if tomorrow we're not human enough? Are we buying into these notions of trying to perform ourselves in ways where we are subject to someone else saying what is human and how the human is performed? And I think this is really key to sort of start querying the instability of these concepts, which posthumanism sort of starts to do, but it's also reliant on these concepts in some ways. And I think that will become more clear as we go on. Because alongside trans politics and gender politics and these unstable categories, we have ondecidal politics. And this idea of trans necropolitics, the idea that Black trans bodies and Black trans suffering, Black trans death are used, the value of that death are used to prop up white trans lives. And this concept comes from Snorton and Harita, and they borrow from Mbembe's Necropolitics, talking about how we foster our own sense of sovereignty through the death and the suffering of others, and the creation of the other through that death. And so that our subjectification becomes dependent on being a survivor, on surviving in a world that denigrates others. And there's sort of this extraction of the value of Black and trans violence and death that sort of goes, that reminds us that we are so close to not being human, not being more than human, being less than human. And I think that those sorts of values linger in post-humanism in some ways. And Warren talks about how whiteness requires Black fungibility, that this construction of subjectivity, of sovereignty, is dependent on the devaluation of Black bodies. And he talks about how Winter's genres of man can only, for Black bodies, can only exist under erasure. So he talks about how, you know, a Black trans man, and the trans is erased, it's crossed out, because the occupation of that humanist category is always partial. It's only so far, because they're never let into the human category fully. And this sort of onticidal politics sort of really highlights the way in which we're always on the edge of how human is defined. And humanism positions Blackness and other forms of otherness outside of its ontological matrix, so that they're unable to occupy the category of human. And so my fear is the whiteness of post-humanism is so embedded in our logics and in the way in which we demand sort of particular politics that that we end up reproducing these sorts of onticidal exclusions in the way that we do post-humanism. In particular, the way in which so much of post-humanism is predicated on Western logics and of rationality, of who gets included, who gets excluded, what sorts of arguments you can make, what sorts of voices that we listen to. And I think that the Indigenous and Black critiques of post-humanism really highlight that while there is a lot of good stuff going on and people are optimistic about it, that there really is this continued sort of habit of neglecting particular voices or failing to listen to people, or the sanctioned ignorance around all of the theory that has sort of, well, not even theory, all of the worldings that have emerged from Indigenous spaces that we don't account for and that aren't part of our citational politics. And so the question of the chapter, because for me, this is a space of real discomfort, because I am a post-human scholar, and I am very much a white post-human scholar, and I don't want my work to reproduce these sorts of dynamics. I don't want it to sort of participate in the recolonization of academic spaces. And I think that Alison Jones, who is a Pakeha academic from Aotearoa, New Zealand, she talks about the way in which Pakeha, or white European settler people in Aotearoa, have a tendency to refuse when things get difficult, to push away the problem, to say, this is too difficult, it's too uncomfortable, I have no power in these spaces, I'm not entitled to use these spaces, I don't know how to engage in these spaces without feeling like I'm appropriating. These are really difficult questions, and I think we push them away a lot. And the advice that I was always given by Te Kaweho Hoskins, who is a Māori academic at the University of Auckland, was that it's actually the most important thing to do is to sit with these things and to stay in relation with them and engage in that discomfort and be willing to be out of place and uncomfortable and to tread carefully and engage in those very delicate politics where you know you don't belong. But you stand with in a way where you try to learn and sort of be a witness to these politics. And so really at recognizing that this was going to be a really difficult process, and reading this literature was really uncomfortable, because it really resonated with a lot of the things that, happen in academic spaces that I'm part of. My question was, what would posthumanism have to do to not operate as a recolonizing mechanism? Like, what do we do? How do we reconfigure this in a way where we're actually contributing and we're uplifting and we're creating a world that doesn't reproduce the colonialities that we've inherited? And so I think about these things in relationships and sexualities education spaces. This idea that transnormativities in sexuality education foster trans necropolitics. This is a problem. We don't want our schools, creating these dynamics where certain forms of transness are accepted and other forms of transness are denigrated. But it really requires that we engage in this difficult question of how we simultaneously combat the racialization of gender as well as the non-innocence of education, recognizing that our schools are often sites of recolonization. These are the sites where we're often reproducing the very lessons that colonization wants us to learn, becoming the sorts of citizens that perform in colonial spaces. And there's this question that was actually posed to me in a lecture I gave a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about trans necropolitics in education, and one of the students said, "Do you think posthumanism could provide some solutions?" And I think it's really tempting. It's really tempting to be like, well, yeah, like some solutions, like there are some solutions. And like, I admit I've made attempts. I mean, this is my work. It's trying to figure out how my work in these spaces can sort of undo these politics and can create more ethical ways of engaging in the world. And I didn't want to blatantly self-promote, but like I've chucked a few of my own works in the reference list if you want to look at these things. And I think there are interesting ways of doing it. And justice is always going to be partial. So it's not like you're going to find something that is the perfect way of engaging with these things or dismantling these sorts of dynamics. But maybe posthumanism shouldn't save the day, which is not an absolute statement. It's not that it shouldn't, but maybe we should be asking ourselves each time, is this the place of posthumanism? Does it belong here? Are there other solutions that we can find? And I think that often these questions aren't asked before. People just go, oh, well, like there's this brilliant new theory and it offers all of these things that dismantle, humanist ways of being. But I think that because we're so eager about it, that sometimes it can lead to reproducing things that we don't realize are sort of operating under the surface. And I think that the self-assurance of posthumanism has meant that it's developed a bit of a savior complex around some of these things, and that we should be cautious about it. I want to tell you a story because I was really struggling with these questions. This challenging space where I didn't know what to do. I had read Calvin Warren's Onticide, and I was seriously like, well, you can't fix that. Yes. I mean, I'm not going to be the one who fixes that. And I don't know how to engage. I don't know how to, like, what could I possibly do that would produce posthumanism in another way that might be more ethical, that might be more responsive to the sorts of worlds that we're living in. And I was walking through the park with my dog one day, and we lived down the road from a kura, which is like a Māori immersion school. So they speak in te reo Māori, and these 6 or 7-year-old kids were walking past us speaking in fluent te reo. And this is particularly significant because te reo was effectively ostracized, like officially ostracized until 1967. So there's, Te Reo has gone through revitalization, and it's wonderful, and there's so much more access, but it's still quite inaccessible on the whole. And so I was walking through the park, and these kids were speaking in Te Reo, and it suddenly hit me. These kids are not just speaking in Te Reo, they're living in Te Ao Māori. They're living in the Māori world. They're being taught the Māori world. They exist within a completely different ontology. Because the way in which the Māori world is sort of created is relational. And it sort of got me thinking about what sorts of gender dynamics were operating in these spaces. And I sort of went back to Elizabeth Kerikeri's work around Takatapui. And Takatapui talks about how gender, sex, and sexuality are relationally constituted, and they're inseparable from being Māori. That being said, gender, sex, and sexuality are also inseparable from being white, if you're white, but we don't acknowledge it. But there is this intense sense of like we are relationally constituted. We can't know ourselves outside of our Māoriness. And that when it comes to Takatapui people, while there has certainly been major influences of cis heteronormativities in Aotearoa New Zealand, within Māori tikanga or ethical praxis, broadly speaking, these are terrible translations, the understanding is that takatapui are always already part of the family, because you can't separate yourself from your genealogy or your whakapapa, and that we're always already connected through wairoa, or spirit. And so this notions of enacting homophobia or transphobia or trans necropolitics, for that matter, are simply inconceivable in this way. And because there's this understanding of manaakitanga, which literally means practices that uplift the agency, and that all mana is connected, that the constitution of who I am and the constitution of who you are not separable. And so when I denigrate your mana or your agency, I also denigrate mine, because we are connected. And it comes out of this Māori idea of kanohi ki te kanohi, which means seeing eye to eye. And Te Kaweho Hoskins talks about the way in which kanohi ki te kanohi is sort of comparable to Barad's or originally Levinas's notion of responsibility, in the way in which ourselves are co-constituted by the infinite other, by everything that we're not. And so that you can't sort of see yourself as separate to the other. And so therefore, trans necropolitics just simply can't exist in Te Ao Māori. And so I had this moment in the park, surrounded by these children, and sort of thinking, I think the point here is that I don't have to go looking for answers in post-humanism that aren't even problems. Like, I don't have to go looking for solutions in post-humanism when I could look for worlds where those problems don't even exist. That there are ways of thinking and being that exclude these ways, and that because of our sanctioned ignorance around these things, we often miss out on these opportunities. And so it's not to say that we should throw out post-humanism, but it is to say that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we don't have to extract these knowledges from others, but that part of these ethical practices are about upholding the Indigenous knowledges that exist. And not to say that we idealize Indigenous knowledges, that they're perfect, but actually we look for places where these things create the sorts of worlds that we'd like to live in, to exist in, and that is about upholding the integrity of those worlds and honouring the sorts of pluriversal politics that mean that we can actually learn from each other in productive ways. Yeah, and that's about all I've got. I've got a couple of pages of references, which I'm happy to send out to everyone. And yeah, that's me.